Okay, this is our video lecture for Chapter 18 to replace our in-class lecture for today. If you're watching this video, this is for my students at Hudson County Community College, not for any of my other classes. And this is for Western Civ 2. And this is, again, Chapter 18, Absolute and Limited Monarchs. I'm using a program called Screencast-O-Matic. One of the issues with it is that it only allows me to record videos of about 15 minutes in length, at which point I have to begin a new video. So this lecture, which is probably going to be about 45 minutes long, will likely have to be split into 3 separate videos, but we'll see. Perhaps I can fit it into 2. There's a quiz attached to this video, which is already uploaded, but I'll make available once the video is posted. Please do not take the quiz until you've watched the video and make sure you've refreshed yourself on Chapter 18. This image right here is the siege of Vienna. This is reflective of the Ottoman Turks and their attempts to expand into Eastern Europe. They actually besieged Vienna twice, once in the 16th century and then once in the 17th century. Both attempts failed. But the second attempt became closer to actual success. However, in both instances, the Viennese were able to fight off the Turks and stop them from conquering Vienna. And this Turkish attempt at the conquest of Vienna, which is the capital of the Habsburgs, who were the de facto rulers of the Holy Roman Empire, marked their sort of high water mark. If the Turks couldn't take Vienna, they couldn't continue to expand into Europe, and this was as far as they got. This, as always, is the chronology that I supply you with, and as always, don't pay too much attention to the chronology. I'm not going to ask you dates. I'm more going to ask you time periods. So what happened in the 16th century, what happened in the 17th century, rather than what happened in 1650. So let's talk about absolutism, which is one model of government during this period. And our model of absolutism that the book provides you with is Louis XIV, the so-called Sun King of France. I talked to you last class about Henry IV, who founded the new royal dynasty of France called the Bourbons. The Bourbons were sort of a compromise between the Catholics and the Huguenots. Henry, being a former Huguenot, agreed to convert to Catholicism in exchange for being awarded the throne of France. He famously did so, attending Mass in Notre Dame, being converted, being baptized, and at the end, one of his friends asked, so how was it? And he said, well, Paris was worth the Mass. Under Henry IV and later Louis XIV, Cardinal Richelieu, who was the royal advisor, the royal chancellor, broke the power of the Huguenots by installing attendants. Attendants were royal officials who would be appointed to basically rule over rural provinces and spread out areas of the country and enforce the king's policies. They were effectively reflections of the government on the ground that would reach into even very distant or remote parts of the kingdom to make sure that they were following the same laws as are being enforced everywhere. It was a way of extending royal control throughout the entire kingdom. An event in Louis XIV's youth was a rebel uprising named the Fronde, which is sling, so-called because the rebels armed themselves with slings and engaged in guerrilla tactics. He survived this uprising kind of by the skin of his teeth, and afterward realized the danger of the feudal system. The feudal system essentially meant that the king basically had no standing army of his own. Instead, what he would do is rely on the armies of his vassals, who would come to fulfill their feudal obligation to defend him or fight for him when the time came. The problem with this is, although the feudal lords are under an obligation, they would try to answer it as weakly as possible, with as few men as possible, basically as few as they thought they had to, partially to prevent loss of their own men and partially to keep the position of the king weak. So Louis XIV built up his own standing army called a retinue, and he ruled backed by this army without regard to national assemblies or long-standing laws which allowed for feudal elective influence in the laws of France. Louis, however, was careful not to diffuse the traditional power of the nobles, or the traditional privileges of the nobles, I should say. He did diffuse their power, but not their privileges. So the privilege to the right of being in the assembly wasn't revoked, but the assemblies were simply not held, for instance. So he sought to not change the privileges associated with being a noble, but change the power the nobles could execute through these privileges. After the Fronde rebellion and after Cardinal Richelieu's installation of the Intendants, Louis revoked the Edict of Nantes, which made it illegal to be a Huguenot in France. You remember Henry IV had issued the Edict of Nantes previously to allow toleration of being a Huguenot. One way in which Louis expressed his power and the influence and the prestige of the monarch and impressed his vassal lords with the influence and prestige of the monarch was through cultural and artistic movements and the state sponsoring of culture and the arts. This was illustrated by the construction of many grand buildings like the Palace of Versailles, but not limited to it. France also followed an economic theory called mercantilism, which is, I believe I talked about last class, was essentially state sponsorship of the economy, where the state would play a role in economic development even while a large part of the economy was market-based. So the country should make more money exporting goods to foreign lands than they spend importing goods, resulting in a fair balance of trade, and this balance of trade would be maintained by the state. Louis was also often involved in wars, not only against rebels, but against foreign powers, fighting the Holy Roman Empire and trying to expand his territory, and dealing with challenges from England, Holland, and northern Italy. Other monarchs were influenced by Louis, seeing his system of governance, of firm control by the monarch over the state as the best way to rule, and absolute monarchs were seen as the most effective form of government. So absolute monarchies began to appear in Eastern Europe as well. We had the Habsburgs in Austria, the Hohenzollerns in Prussia, which will later develop into the Kingdom of Germany, and the Romanovs of Russia. There were actually two branches of Habsburg, the Spanish Habsburgs, who ruled Spain and the Netherlands, and the Austrian branch, who ruled in the East, in Eastern Europe, in what's today Austria, Hungary, parts of Poland, and the Balkans. And the Austrian branch, after defeating the Turks in their siege of Vienna, were able to expand their territories eastward. The Hohenzollerns came to rule a number of territories in northeast Germany, which became known as Prussia. Today, most of it is part of Poland, but despite that, it was known as Prussia at the time and was German in ethnicity and culture. The Hohenzollerns were Protestant, which had the effect of a lot of the French Huguenots fleeing to Prussia and bringing their culture, their influence, their incomes to this new state. The Romanovs began to rule in Russia in 1613 after a period of civil war in which they defeated the previous ruling dynasty and overthrew them. The Romanovs made sure that their position as usurpers did not undermine their authority with the people by being protective of the Orthodox religion, which they felt and the Russian people felt had been under siege by rival nations like Poland, Sweden, and the expansive powers of the Ottoman Empire. Peter the Great, who is probably the most influential of the Romanovs, sought to westernize Russia. In particular, he imported everything from French literature to hairstyles and clothing from Europe to Russia to sort of imprint upon the Russian elite European culture, where previously their culture had been more Eastern. One idea of which absolutism rested on was the idea of divine right authority, and that's that the kings were God's representatives on earth. King James of England, as well as Jacques Bossuet, a French bishop, claimed that kings were to be obeyed unilaterally, since they were doing God's work, and God's work was governing the realm. Thomas Hobbes took a bit of a different approach when he wrote that absolute kingship was necessary not because of divine right, but since without it, the natural state of humans would be warlike and chaotic. In other words, a strong ruler was needed, regardless of whether he was backed by God or not. Nonetheless, their ideas were similar in the fact that there needed to be a strong ruler making decisions because the people could not govern themselves. This idea of divine right rulership wasn't actually that new. In the Middle Ages, and especially in the early Middle Ages prior to the Crusades, kings had often claimed they were ruling through the will of God, or that they were God's vice-regent on earth. This fell out of fashion during the Renaissance and sort of the cultural awakening and weakening of religion that followed. However, this era sees a move back into the religious realm, with kings claiming again to get their authority to rule directly from God. This is Louis XIV, the Sun King, and this pose he has here is meant to instill upon you several images. First off, his robe shows his right to rule. It's the color blue commonly associated with emperors or royalty, and the blue dye itself would have been a symbol of his elite status because most clothes could not be dyed. Also on the robe is the fleur-de-lis, and the fleur-de-lis was at that point a sort of symbol of French nationalism. So he's showing himself both as a king or emperor, having elite status, and shows his French nationalism. You can also see his sword showing himself as a military ruler, and his rod of state showing himself as a political ruler as well. Everything about him is meant to instill upon you his stature and his importance, even down to his high heels, meaning that he would be taller than those around him. High heels were actually begun as a men's fashion statement. Elite men would wear them to show elite status, and the higher your heels were, the more status you had, because height was associated with status. It wasn't until much later that women began to wear high heels as their own type of fashion statement. At this time, and for quite a number of years following, high heels were a male fashion statement worn by men of elite status. This shows you a map of the areas we're talking about. So this is France, ruled by Louis. And you can see these areas are the areas where he expanded at the expense of the Holy Roman Empire and the Netherlands, despite challenges from Britain and Spain. You can see here in yellow the holdings of the Austrian Habsburgs and the Spanish Bourbons in Spain. Here you have the Russian Empire, ruled by Peter the Great. And these gains here in purple show the gains by Peter and his successors in the Baltic states at the expense of Poland. You can also see the new state of Prussia, which was formed by the Hohenzollern dynasty, ruling part of Germany, including Berlin, but mostly their territory was over here in territory that used to be German but is now part of Poland. So the British Constitution is the challenge or the opposition type of government to absolute monarchs. And this came about as a result of several years of civil war and a breakdown of traditional monarchy in Britain. We had James I of England, who had previously been the King of Scotland, and through a fluke in inheritance, being the only male left of that line, inherited the kingdom of England, Scotland, and Wales, ruling them all as one monarch. I'm going to stop here and continue in part 2 of this video.